It started as just another criminal justice reform segment on The Tonight Show, until a prison librarian revealed that after 36 years of teaching literacy to incarcerated individuals, she could no longer see the words that had opened countless minds behind bars. The Tonight Show studio was filled with thoughtful energy from Jimmy Fallon's commitment to addressing criminal justice reform and prison rehabilitation programs. Tonight's focus was on prison education, and Jimmy had assembled advocates, former inmates, and corrections professionals who understood that education could be the difference between recidivism and redemption. The segment was designed to educate viewers about education in correctional facilities while honoring educators who provided learning opportunities to people often written off by society. Jimmy understood that behind every prison education program was someone who believed literacy could change lives. Among the guests was Margaret Chen, a 63-year-old prison librarian at Riverside Correctional Facility for over 3 decades. Margaret was soft-spoken with silver hair and a neat bun, wearing a cardigan over a white blouse, and her patient demeanor suggested someone who worked with people needing second chances. Her eyes seemed to strain when looking at printed materials, and she frequently adjusted her reading glasses, suggesting her relationship with written words had become challenging. Margaret represented the dedicated librarians and educators who worked in correctional facilities across America, people who saw beyond inmates' crimes to their potential for growth, learning, and eventual reintegration into society through education and literacy. Jimmy had invited Margaret to share insights about prison education, perhaps discuss the literacy programs that had helped inmates earn their GEDs, or talk about the transformative power of books and learning in correctional settings. It was supposed to be an inspiring conversation about second chances and the role of education in breaking the cycle of incarceration. But as Jimmy began the interview, something in Margaret's demeanor immediately suggested that this would be more than a simple celebration of prison education programs. "Margaret," Jimmy said with respect, 36 years as a prison librarian? Tell us what drew you to this work." Margaret smiled sadly. "Mr. Fallon, I believe everyone deserves a second chance, and education is often the key. When someone learns to read, discovers knowledge, it changes how they see themselves and their possibilities." The audience was quiet, understanding the hope Margaret brought to her work. "What's it like teaching literacy to adults who struggled with education?" Jimmy asked. "Many were failed by the education system before they committed crimes," Margaret explained. "Some are functionally illiterate, dropped out as children, or have undiagnosed learning disabilities." Jimmy leaned forward, clearly moved by the scope of educational neglect that Margaret had encountered. "For 36 years, Margaret continued, I've worked with inmates who are serving sentences ranging from a few months to life imprisonment. I've taught basic literacy skills to people in their 50s who had never learned to read, helped inmates earn their GEDs, facilitated book clubs that gave people a chance to discuss ideas and perspectives they'd never encountered." The studio was growing quieter as the audience began to understand the profound impact that Margaret's work had on people who were often seen only as their worst actions. "Margaret," Jimmy said, "in 36 years, how many inmates have you worked with in your literacy and education programs?" Margaret paused, calculating numbers that clearly carried enormous emotional weight. "Over 8,000 individuals, Mr. Fallon. 8,000 people who came through our library and education programs, each with their own story, their own challenges, their own potential for growth and change." Jimmy was clearly moved by the scope of educational impact that Margaret had facilitated throughout her career. 8,000 people. That's incredible. How many of those individuals successfully completed their education goals? Margaret nodded, but instead of pride, her expression showed something that looked like deep concern and sadness. Thousands have earned their GEDs, hundreds have completed college courses, many have discovered a love of reading that sustains them long after their release. But my ability to continue this work is now compromised in a way that breaks my heart. Jimmy's expression shifted to concern as he sensed that Margaret was leading toward something difficult. "What do you mean?" Jimmy asked gently. Margaret touched her reading glasses and squinted slightly, as if trying to focus on something just out of reach. When she spoke, her words carried a weight that made everyone in the studio understand they were witnessing something profound and heartbreaking. "Mr. Fallon," Margaret said, "I can't see the words anymore." The studio fell silent. Jimmy's expression showed alarm. "What's happening with your vision?" Jimmy asked. Margaret adjusted her glasses. "Macular degeneration," she said. "Age-related deterioration that's worsened over 18 months, making it impossible to read text clearly or help inmates with assignments." The audience was stunned. Understanding this meant the end of a career built on written language. Prison library work depends on reading with inmates, helping with educational materials and assignments, Margaret explained, tears flowing. "If I can't see text clearly, I can't provide literacy support that can change someone's life." The studio was so quiet that the air conditioning seemed loud. Jimmy's face showed the devastating impact of Margaret's confession. 6 months ago, Margaret continued, I was working with a young man who was struggling to read a job application he wanted to complete for his release. I couldn't see his writing clearly enough to help him identify his errors, and he became frustrated because he couldn't understand why. I couldn't help him the way I used to. Jimmy could see that Margaret was tormented by the idea that her vision loss might deny inmates the educational support they needed for successful reintegration. 3 months ago, Margaret said, now speaking with obvious difficulty as emotion overwhelmed her, I was leading a book club discussion about a novel that deals with redemption and second chances. I couldn't read the text clearly enough to follow along with the discussion, and I realized that my inability to see was compromising my ability to facilitate the learning that these men depended on. Jimmy stood up and walked closer to Margaret, understanding that she was mourning not just the end of her career, but the loss of her ability to provide the educational opportunities that could transform lives. Margaret, Jimmy said, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder, you've spent 36 years using your love of learning to give people second chances through education. The fact that macular degeneration has affected your vision doesn't diminish the incredible number of lives you've changed. Margaret looked at Jimmy, though it was clear she was having difficulty seeing him clearly. Mr. Fallon, there are people in prison right now who want to learn to read, who want to earn their education, who need literacy skills to succeed when they're released. Every person I can't help because of my vision problems is someone who might not get the second chance that education provides. Jimmy could see that Margaret was devastated by the idea that her disability might prevent inmates from accessing the educational opportunities that could break the cycle of incarceration. When you say you can't see the words anymore, Jimmy asked, what does that mean for your future as a prison librarian? Margaret looked around the studio, though her gaze seemed to struggle to focus. Next month, I'm officially retiring from the prison library. After 36 years of helping people discover the transformative power of education, I have to step away because I can no longer see the words that could change their lives. Jimmy looked directly into the camera. Ladies and gentlemen, what Margaret is describing represents something we rarely discuss about education professionals who work in challenging environments. The physical demands of constant reading and close work can affect the very abilities that teachers and librarians depend on to help others learn. He turned back to Margaret. But Margaret, before you step away from prison education, I want to show you something. I want you to understand what 36 years of believing in second chances has meant to the people whose lives you've transformed through literacy and learning. Margaret looked confused, squinting to see Jimmy clearly. What do you mean? Jimmy walked to his desk and picked up his phone. Margaret, you mentioned that you've worked with over 8,000 inmates in your literacy programs. What if we could show you the impact of that education? What if we could connect you with some of the people whose lives were changed by learning to read and write in your library? Jimmy looked into the camera. We're putting out a call right now. If Margaret Chen helped you learn to read, earn your GED, or discover the power of education while you were incarcerated, we want to hear from you. Use the hashtag #Thank you, Margaret, and share how her dedication to literacy gave you a second chance. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within minutes, social media was flooded with testimonials from former inmates whose lives had been transformed by Margaret's education programs. Stories poured in from across the country of people who had learned to read in prison, earned their high school diplomas, and gone on to build successful lives after release because of the foundation Margaret had provided. But Jimmy had arranged something even more powerful. Over the following week, his production team worked to track down some of the former inmates whose lives Margaret had transformed through education, people who wanted to thank her personally for giving them the tools they needed to rebuild their lives. The next week, Jimmy invited Margaret back to the show for what she thought would be a follow-up conversation about supporting educators with vision loss. Instead, he had arranged something unprecedented. Margaret, Jimmy said as Margaret sat carefully on stage, squinting to see him clearly. You told me that you're heartbroken about the people you can no longer help because of your vision loss. Tonight I want you to meet some of the people whose second chances began in your prison library. Former inmates whose lives Margaret had transformed thanked her personally. David Martinez, who learned to read at 32 while serving 5 years, said, Miss Margaret, you taught me to read when I was 32. You showed me it wasn't too late to learn, that I wasn't stupid. Because of you, I earned my GED, got a job as foreman, and read to my children every night. Jennifer Williams, transformed by Prison Book Club, added, You led discussions about women overcoming adversity. You helped me discover I was intelligent, could think critically. You encouraged my college education and helped with admission essays. Robert Chen, now a practicing attorney, concluded, You guided me through college courses and supported my dream of becoming a lawyer. I now represent people with criminal records rebuilding their lives. The testimonials revealed Margaret's teaching skills, her ability to see potential in people written off by society, and her belief that education provided a path to redemption. As the testimonials concluded, Jimmy turned to Margaret, who was surrounded virtually by dozens of people whose lives had been transformed by her belief in the power of education. Margaret, Jimmy said, speaking clearly so she could hear him, you told me that you can't see the words anymore, but what we've heard tonight is that 36 years of teaching literacy has created words and stories and knowledge that will continue long after you step away from the prison library. Jimmy looked directly into the camera, and to everyone watching, Margaret's story reminds us that education professionals who work with society's most challenging populations deserve our support and recognition, especially when their own abilities are affected by their years of service. He turned back to Margaret, which is why we're announcing the Margaret Chen Prison Education Foundation, which will provide vision assistance technology, educational resources, and support for prison librarians and educators dealing with disabilities. 6 months later, Margaret had been fitted with advanced low-vision aids that allowed her to return to prison education work in a consulting role, developing literacy curricula and training new prison educators, while her assistive technology helped her continue to work with written materials. The foundation had provided support for dozens of correctional educators with various disabilities. More importantly, Margaret's story had brought attention to the unique needs of prison educators and led to new research into adaptive technologies that could extend the careers of teachers and librarians experiencing vision loss. Margaret learned that her impact on prison education didn't depend on her ability to see every word clearly. It depended on her belief in the transformative power of learning and her commitment to helping others discover their own potential. The thousands of people whose lives she had touched through education learned that sometimes the greatest gift they could give their teacher was the reminder that knowledge shared creates wisdom that continues to grow long after the original lesson ends. Because sometimes the people who help others see the light of learning need to be reminded that they have illuminated minds in ways that continue to shine even when their own vision grows dim, and that 36 years of teaching literacy creates an understanding of human potential that transcends the to see individual words on a page.